Here I was, minding my own business on move-in day when I met the self-declared law of the neighborhood. "That's exactly what my Hokarina real name Victoria Cross yelled while she called the cops on me. I was just unloading boxes from the moving truck into my $500,000 dream cabin when she decided my truck was too much of a disturbance for her precious community peace. The police showed up, questioning me as though I was trespassing on my own lakefront property. Victoria stood there, smug as ever, like she'd just staged a coup. Little did she know, picking a fight with someone like me, a person who loves digging deep into details, would prove to be her biggest mistake. What I ended up uncovering about her hoe's shady history would tear her carefully built power apart and reveal a 15-year-long scam that had robbed thousands from every neighbor. If you've ever battled an outrageous hoe, you know how this feels. After years of hustling as a game developer and saving every cent, I finally bought this lakeside retreat. $500,000 for a quiet paradise, a place to code in peace, catch sunsets over the water, and maybe learn to fish the way my dad once did. The first time I saw the shimmering lake behind my new place, I felt like the luckiest person alive, though that feeling lasted all of 30 seconds. Then Victoria Cross made her grand entrance. What struck me first wasn't her carefully styled clothes or her stern presence. It was the way she walked straight toward me, as if she'd marched this same path dozens of times. Her gaze didn't just wander, it evaluated everything. My boxes, my truck, even my posture on my own driveway. I was sweating slightly in the cool morning air, carrying a box of computer gear when she strode across the street, every step radiating authority. Her silver hair was tied into a neat bun that gave her an air of both elegance and intimidation, and her outfit, a crisp white blouse with khaki pants, practically screamed, "Yes, I'd like to speak to the manager." Her eyes were the most unsettling part. They swept over my property with the cold calculation of a general assessing the battlefield. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice edged with that special kind of command that makes you stop in your tracks, even if you don't want to. "Your truck is blocking traffic." I glanced around at the completely deserted street. Birds were chirping, and there wasn't a single other car in sight. My truck wasn't even on the street, it sat neatly on my driveway. "Sorry," I said, gently setting the box down and wiping my hands on my jeans. "I can move it right now if it's in the way." She ignored my offer entirely. Instead, Victoria pulled out her phone in a slow, practiced motion that suggested she'd done this before. 911, "I'd like to report a traffic violation in the Lakeside Meadows community," she announced. I stood there, mouth hanging open, watching as this woman called the police on me for moving into my own house. "Ma'am, really? I can move the truck. It'll take half a minute," I tried to explain. She cut me off by raising a manicured finger, still speaking to the dispatcher. "Yes, there's a large commercial vehicle blocking the road. The driver is uncooperative." Uncooperative? I hadn't even been given the chance to cooperate. When she finally hung up, she turned to me with a cold smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her expression oddly predatory. "I'm Victoria Cross, president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. Here I am, the law." The quiet certainty in her voice sent a chill through me. This wasn't just an irritable neighbor. This was someone convinced she had absolute power, and not just over the rules, but over me and everyone else living here. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. Out stepped Officer Johnson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Morning, Mrs. Cross," he greeted her, his tired sigh hinting that he'd been through this before. "What's going on today?" Today, the word itself sounded like this sort of call was a regular event. Victoria launched into a dramatic retelling of how my moving truck had apparently thrown the entire neighborhood into chaos. The officer listened politely, occasionally glancing at the still empty road with what I recognized as weary resignation. When she finally finished, Officer Johnson turned to me. "You moving in?" "Yes, sir. Closed on the house last month. I can move the truck, no problem." He looked at my truck, then at the street, then back at Victoria. The resigned look on his face told me that this wasn't about my truck or even me at all. It was part of a long-standing pattern. The way he spoke, the sigh he gave when he first saw her, and the brief, sympathetic look he shot me all said the same thing. "Welcome to the real Lakeside Meadows, Mrs. Cross," he said. "The truck is on his driveway and isn't blocking traffic." Then, turning to me, he added, "Welcome to the neighborhood. You'll figure out how to handle this." The way he said handle this felt less like friendly advice and more like a quiet warning. And as the patrol car drove away, I knew I'd stumbled into something far more complicated than just a neighborly dispute. I turned back to my truck, hoping to finish unpacking and leave that bizarre encounter behind me, but Victoria wasn't ready to let it go. She lingered a while longer, her sharp gaze fixed squarely on my cabin. It felt unsettling, like watching someone silently calculating the value of something they already considered theirs. "Lovely place," she finally remarked, but there was a hungry edge to her tone that made my skin prickle. "My family used to own all this land, every acre of it." She didn't sound nostalgic. It wasn't the wistful sadness of someone reminiscing, it was the cold certainty of someone who felt something had been unfairly taken and who fully intended to reclaim it. "All of it," she repeated, her eyes locked on my new home. "Every single acre." As she turned and walked away, I felt the thrill of owning my dream cabin drain away, leaving behind a quiet dread. What exactly had I gotten myself into? If you've ever faced off against an HOA tyrant, you probably know the feeling. A few days later, I decided to apply for a permit to build a simple dock. Nothing extravagant, just a small wooden platform to enjoy my morning coffee and maybe launch a kayak. Determined not to leave anything to chance, I spent 2 nights poring over every HOA guideline, local code, and environmental rule I could find. I measured the site meticulously, drew clear plans, and even included an environmental impact assessment. Wanting to be thorough after Victoria's less than warm welcome, the application turned into a masterpiece. 23 pages of diagrams, material specs, and detailed explanations covering every possible concern I could think of. Confident I checked every box, I submitted it to the HOA review board early Tuesday morning. That same afternoon, the rejection email landed in my inbox. Denied due to a missing comprehensive environmental impact study. I stared at the message, confused. I had included an impact assessment, but apparently it wasn't comprehensive enough. So, I hired a real environmental consultant, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who charged me $800 to scrutinize my modest 12 by 8 feet dock like it was a major infrastructure project. She was incredibly thorough, taking soil and water samples, measuring pH levels, cataloging every bird and fish within sight, and ultimately producing a hefty 47-page report. Her conclusion? My tiny dock would impact the environment about as much as a large duck landing on the lake. She added photographs from every angle, precise measurements of water currents and depths, and even analyzed how the dock might, barely, influence fish spawning patterns. She interviewed neighbors about local wildlife, charted seasonal water levels going back 5 years, and detailed every tree within 50 feet of the proposed build. It was more detailed than some NASA missions get. Feeling sure this time, I resubmitted my application, the new report attached. 2 days later, rejection number 2 arrived, denied, this time because the proposed building materials weren't considered aesthetically compatible with community standards. I'd used pressure-treated lumber, exactly the same material used for the community dock, but fine. If they wanted premium, I'd give them premium. I drove across town to a specialty lumber yard and upgraded to high-end cedar, adding another $500 to the cost. Now my materials list sounded more suited to building a luxury yacht than a small dock. Rejection number 3 came back even faster, denied because the structure may cause visual offense to lake-enjoying residents. A visual offense? It was a dock, not an oil refinery. At this point, it was clear this wasn't really about community guidelines. This was about control, but I wasn't ready to surrender. I redesigned the dock, shrinking it down to a sad little 6 by 6 feet platform, barely big enough for a single chair. Surely they couldn't find fault with something so insignificant. But the 4th rejection was the most absurd yet. Denied pending written approval from 75% of neighborhood residents. Apparently, they expected me to canvass the entire community as if I were running a political campaign. So, that's exactly what I did. I spent an entire Saturday going door to door, explaining my humble dock plan to anyone willing to listen. Most neighbors were sympathetic but reluctant. "Sorry," one woman admitted, glancing around nervously. "We just don't want to get on Victoria's bad side." An older couple with kayaks even chuckled. "Good luck," the husband said, shaking his head. "We've been trying to get permission to repaint our fence for 3 years." It was during these door-to-door visits that I met Walter Hayes, a retired professor in his 70s who lived 4 houses down. His weathered face spoke of a life spent outdoors. When I explained my dock dilemma, he looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part something harder to name. "Son," he said quietly, glancing over toward Victoria's house, "anything that involves the lake around here it's complicated." The way he said complicated made it sound like an understatement hiding something much deeper. It felt like complicated was his polite way of hinting at something far darker. "There's history here most folks don't know," Walter continued, then seemed to stop himself. "But that's not really my place to explain." In the end, I managed to get signatures from about 60% of the neighborhood, but it still wasn't enough. The HOA bylaws apparently demanded a supermajority for any changes to the lakefront, and Victoria made sure to keep that goal just out of reach. At that point, I felt like Charlie Brown chasing after the football, with Victoria playing Lucia moving it away every single time I got close. Then the final email landed in my inbox. And it changed everything. Attached was a file labeled Official HOA Property Map. I opened it and my stomach dropped. According to the map, the entire shoreline of the lake belonged to the HOA. Not just the obvious community areas, but every single foot of shoreline, including the stretch behind my house. I reread it again and again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the message was painfully clear. The $500,000 lakefront home I'd bought apparently didn't come with access to the actual lake. I felt sick. How could this even be legal? I'd bought a lake house, but couldn't step into the lake. Comment scammed if you think I just got completely ripped off. For the next 2 days, I couldn't stop staring at that map, trying to wrap my head around it. Victoria's document claimed I owned my home and the patch of land it stood in, but the moment I stepped closer to the water, I'd be trespassing on HOA property. It felt absurd, like buying a car but being told you couldn't drive it anywhere. Reality felt warped, caught in some bureaucratic trap where property rights were little more than suggestions. By Thursday morning, frustration finally burned through my disbelief. I'd paid $500,000 for the right to walk straight out my back door to the lake. No HOA document was going to erase that. So, I decided to test their claim. What were they really going to do? Call the police because I dared walk across my own backyard? At around 10 in the morning, I stepped outside, trying to look as relaxed and confident as possible. I wasn't planning anything dramatic, and just a slow walk from my deck down to the water's edge, maybe 30 feet in total. I figured I'd dip my toes in, snap a quick photo to prove my crime, then head back inside to research my next move. I'd barely made it halfway when Victoria appeared as if conjured by smoke. One moment I was alone, the next she was standing 20 feet away, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, looking like she'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Stop right there," she yelled, triumph dripping from every word. "You're trespassing on HOA property." And she'd come prepared. She had paperwork ready, a violation notice, another copy of that ridiculous map, and her phone camera already rolling like she was filming a nature documentary. "I'm calling the police to report criminal trespass," she declared, loud enough that half the neighborhood probably heard. I glanced around and sure enough, curious faces began peeking through windows, drawn by the commotion. Great. Barely a week after moving in, and here I was becoming the neighborhood's main source of gossip. "Ma'am," I started, forcing my voice to stay calm, "this is literally my backyard. I just want to touch the water. I bought lakefront property." But she cut me off with a raised, manicured finger, already dialing. "Yes, I need police response for criminal trespass at Lakeside Meadows," she said into her phone. "The perpetrator is attempting to access restricted HOA property despite previous warnings." Previous warnings? The only warning I'd gotten was about where my moving truck could park. Officer Johnson showed up about 15 minutes later, looking even less thrilled to be there than the first time we met. By then, Victoria had planted herself squarely between me and the lake, still holding her papers, narrating her version of events into her phone camera. When the officer stepped out of his cruiser, She launched straight into what sounded like a memorized speech about trespassing, HOA authority, and the sanctity of community standards. "Officer Johnson," she began, her voice perfectly calm and rehearsed. "This individual has been warned repeatedly about the boundaries of his property. As you can see from this official home map, the shoreline he's trying to access is common HOA land. He has no right to be there, and I'm asking that you enforce our property rights." She handed the officer her stack of carefully prepared paperwork like it was evidence in a criminal trial. She stood there with the cool confidence of someone who'd done this dance before, and the sinking feeling in my gut told me she probably had. Officer Johnson took his time, studying Victoria's map and comparing it to something on his tablet. His eyes flicked back and forth between the document, the real property lines, then back again. Finally, he walked over to me, wearing the expression of someone forced to deliver bad news. "Sir," he said quietly, "I need you to return to your house. I get that this is frustrating, but I have to go by the paperwork I am given. And according to this map, you're currently on HOA property." The walk back to my house was barely 30 feet. It felt like the longest walk of my life. Each step was a public defeat, and I could feel neighbors peering out from behind curtains, watching me get escorted off what I thought was my own land. Victoria stood there, arms folded, a self-satisfied smile on her face, like someone who'd just sprung a trap they'd been setting for weeks. She'd outmaneuvered me completely, and we both knew it. I sat in my living room afterward, staring at the lake through the window like a prisoner staring out from behind bars. $500,000 for a lakefront house, and I wasn't allowed near the water. It felt like buying a car with no engine, or a book whose pages were glued together. The American dream had twisted into a surreal nightmare, where a single HOA president seemed to have more power than common sense or even the police. That night, desperation set in. I dove into research and reading about easements, riparian rights, historical land grants, anything that might explain or undo what had happened. Most of the legal language was confusing, but I kept running into references to grandfathered access and cases where original land rights overruled later HOA rules. Maybe there was something here, maybe Walter knew more, but what if Victoria had already erased the paper trail? Type "fight back if you think Jake should keep digging." By Saturday morning, I found myself standing on Walter Hayes's front porch, gripping a manila folder that held Victoria's HOA map. I barely knew the man, but when he'd hinted about history and complications, there'd been a look in his eyes like someone carrying a story he'd been waiting to tell. Walter answered the door wearing paint-splattered overalls, a coffee mug in hand and glasses perched low on his nose. His face shifted from mild surprise to something more guarded the moment he saw what I was holding. "Morning, Jake," he said, glancing over my shoulder toward Victoria's place. "What brings you over?" I told him everything on my so-called lake access problema and handed over the map. I watched his face carefully as he studied it. Then, to my surprise, Walter started chuckling. The chuckle grew into a full laugh as he shook his head in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, setting down his coffee and removing his glasses to wipe them. "That's some creative cartography right there." Victoria always did know her way around a computer. He looked at me, and his eyes were suddenly sharp and clear. "Son, this map is fake." "Not old, not wrong, fake." My heart skipped. "Wait," I said, barely breathing. "You're telling me she just made it up?" Walter nodded and motioned for me to come inside. It's time someone explained the real story of this place. Inside, his home looked exactly how you'd expect from a retired professor. Shelves stuffed with books, comfortable furniture worn soft with age, and little collections of artifacts and memories everywhere you looked. Walter disappeared into a back room that looked like a study and came back holding a shoebox that looked like it had survived decades. He settled into an old armchair and took a slow breath. "Your neighbor Victoria," he began, "comes from what used to be the founding family around here. Her father, Henry Cross, owned this whole stretch of land back in the 50s and 60s. Hundreds of acres, including the lake and everything around it." He opened the shoebox and started sifting through yellowed papers and black and white photos. "The Cross family built their first homes here, wrote the first community rules, basically turned this place from empty land into lakeside meadows. Victoria grew up believing it all belonged to Thema and that it always would. Finally, He pulled out a photograph and handed it to me. It was black and white, slightly faded, but the details were sharp. A man in a suit, a Henry Cross, I assume he is seated at a table buried under thick stacks of documents. Around him were men who looked like lawyers or county officials, their expressions tense and focused. But what really caught my eye was what hung behind them, a hand-painted wooden sign, barely visible but unmistakable, that read, "Public Lake Access A Permanent by County Order." Walter watched me see it. "That's Henry Cross," he said quietly. "And that," tapping the words on the sign, "is the piece Victoria doesn't want anyone to remember." Walter pointed to the man in the photograph. "That's Henry Cross, and this was taken the day he signed away the lakefront lots." He leaned back, his gaze distant. "See, Henry's business empire fell apart in '63. Bad investments, legal troubles, the whole thing unraveled. He had no choice but to sell everything, piece by piece, just to cover his debts." Walter traced the photo's worn edge with his finger. "But here's what Victoria doesn't want anyone to remember. County law forced Henry to guarantee permanent public access to the lake when he sold those lots." The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. "Do you mean I actually do have the right to the lake?" Walter nodded, his expression grave. "You and every other homeowner along this shoreline." It was right there in the original sales contracts. By law, he couldn't deny access. Estate water rights statutes were already on the books back then. He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "Victoria knows this. She's known it for years. She just hoped no one would dig deep enough to see through her bluff." For a moment, it felt like I'd been handed the key to a cell I hadn't realized I'd been locked in. But then Walter's next words brought me crashing back to reality. "The problem is proof," he said. "You'll need county documentation, not just my word, and I worry Victoria may have complicated the official records over time." His tone made it clear complicated was his polite way of suggesting tampering or worse. Walter glanced out the window towards Victoria's house, his face shadowed by regret. "I should have spoken up years ago, but Victoria broken bar. She knows how to make life miserable for anyone who questions her. Ask around. The people here have had surprise permit denials, random code violations, anonymous complaints. She knows how to use the system like a club." Then his expression hardened. "But maybe it's time someone with nothing to lose finally stood up to her." I walked home with the photograph tucked carefully in my folder, my thoughts racing. If what Walter said was true, then Victoria's entire scheme was a house of cards built on lies and intimidation. But proving it meant digging into decades-old county archives, possibly fighting records that might have been destroyed or doctored, and going up against someone willing to weaponize local government and even the police against me. Did Victoria destroy the evidence? Comment cover-up if you think she already did. Monday morning, Walter and I stood in the dusty basement of the county courthouse, surrounded by rows of filing cabinets that hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. Sarah, the records clerk, a friendly woman who looked genuinely excited that someone cared about documents this older, had already pulled 3 heavy boxes marked 1963. "You're looking for the Cross property subdivision files from that year, right?" she asked, gently brushing dust off a thick manila folder. She spread the papers across a table with the careful relevance of an archivist handling museum pieces. "Some of these originals are fragile," she warned. "But the good news is everything back then was filed in triplicate. Even if one copy got lost or damaged, there should still be backups." She lifted a magnifying glass and peered closely at a faded carbon copy. "Here it is," she said after a moment. "Subdivision approval dated March 15, 1963. Then she pointed to a barely legible clause buried in the legal text. "A permanent public access to lake waters shall be preserved in perpetuity for all lakefront property owners." It was right, very hard to read, but unmistakable. Every homeowner by the lake had legally protected access that no HOA could revoke, and not even Victoria. But Sarah's next word snapped me back to reality. "To make this stick in court, you'll need a modern land survey to confirm these boundaries still match what's described here. Old property lines used landmarks that might not even exist anymore. A survey makes it real in a judge's eyes." She handed me a business card for a surveying firm that specialized in historical property disputes. When I called, the quote nearly made me drop the phone. $3,000 for a detailed boundary survey and historical research. It was my entire emergency fund, everything I'd saved for furniture, repairs, maybe a small dock. But what choice did I have? I authorized the survey and spent the next week waiting anxiously for results. While I waited, I decided to dig deeper into the HOA's financial records, which, by law, were public. I requested budgets and expenditure reports going back 15 years. What I discovered made my blood boil. For a decade and a half, the HOA had been quietly collecting $50 a month from every homeowner for lake maintenance, money that, as far as I could see, had never actually been spent on the lake at all. For aquatic environmental preservation and shoreline maintenance, the records claimed. I did the math. 47 households paying $50 a month for 15 years, that came out to over $47,000. But the deeper I dug, the more suspicious it got. There were no receipts for equipment, no contracts with environmental services, no proof that any work had been done on the lake. The money just disappeared into a generic HOA account, hidden behind vague labels like administrative costs and community improvements. I compared those supposed expenses against actual visible improvements. Nothing matched. Nearly 50 grand had vanished into thin air with absolutely nothing to show for it. Worse yet, the county records proved the HOA never even owned the lake in the first place. I called a property attorney to explain what I'd found. Her response was immediate and forceful. If you can prove the HOA doesn't legally own the lake, then those fees are fraudulent, she said. This could be the basis for a class action. The community could recover damages and the HOA could face serious penalties. The lawyer's energy was contagious, but she tempered it with a warning. Victoria isn't going to fold quietly. People who run long-term scams usually have backup plans. Be ready for her to fight dirty. Then, late Friday afternoon, the survey company called. I was trying and failing to concentrate on a coding project when my phone buzzed. "Mr. Morrison," the surveyor said, "you're going to want to sit down. Your lake access? It's 100% legal and fully documented. The original easement is still valid and it's actually broader than what most modern developments get. You have nearly the same rights as if you owned the shoreline directly." He paused, but here's where it gets interesting. During our research into the HOA's claims, we confirmed something unusual. The HOA has never legally owned any part of the lake or shoreline. They've been collecting fees for property they don't control. His tone shifted to a mixture of disbelief and fascination. We see this sometimes in older communities, where property lines get creatively redrawn over the years, but this one's blatant. I hung up feeling like I'd just been handed a loaded weapon. This wasn't about my right to build a dock anymore. It was about justice for an entire community defrauded for 15 years. Victoria hadn't just blocked access. She built an entire scheme collecting money for services she had no legal right to offer, on property she didn't own. And now, finally, I had the evidence to prove it. "Mr. Morrison, your lake access is 100% legal. And about those HOA fees, we found something interesting. Jake realizes this isn't just about his DACA, it's about exposing fraud against the whole community." "What did they find about the $47,000? Type expose her if you want to see Victoria get what's coming." The next week, I gave the best acting performance of my life. I avoided eye contact with neighbors, walked around looking defeated, and carried myself like a man who'd finally accepted he couldn't win. Whenever I saw Victoria on her morning walks, I made sure she caught a glimpse of me watching her from my window, my expression hollow, resigned. I wanted her completely confident, fully convinced she'd won. Victoria took the bait perfectly. Within days, bright yellow HOA property and no trespassing signs sprouted around the lake, as if she were marking territory. She began strolling along the shore with her coffee, chin high, like royalty surveying her domain. From my kitchen window, I quietly counted down the days until my plan went into motion. Neighbors started noticing. At first, they whispered about how she seemed bolder, more aggressive, more territorial. The woman from House 12 confided that Victoria had asked why she was walking too close to the water. The elderly couple with the kayaks mentioned Victoria had suggested they rethink their morning paddles. Then Victoria made the mistake I'd been waiting for. She sent me an official HOA email titled "Final Resolution of Property Dispute." "Mr. Morrison, Please be advised that final cabin removal procedures will commence within 30 days. Please prepare for relocation, as your current residence violates established community water access protocols. This is your final notice. Reading that email felt like watching someone confess to a crime in slow motion. She wasn't just threatening me, she was documenting it, time-stamped, signed, and on official whole letterhead. Every lawyer I'd spoken with had said the same thing: get everything in writing. People who abuse power often can't resist showing it off. And here it was, Victoria's arrogance, wrapped up in her own words. While Victoria strutted around playing Queen of the Lake, I started making my own moves. I hired a company that specialized in high-security gate as custom steel, automatic openers, the kind you see at corporate campuses. When they asked about HOA permits, I just smiled. I'll be applying directly with the county, because, as the survey proved, the HOA had no jurisdiction over my lot. I also installed a full security camera system, covering every angle of my property and the shared lake access. If Victoria decided to escalate, every second would be caught on video. Walter called the night before installation. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, clearly worried. "Victoria doesn't like to lose. She might come after you in ways you haven't thought of." "I know," I told him, "but sometimes the best defense is to let your enemy think they've already won." Then I added, "Tomorrow's going to be interesting. You might want to keep your camera ready." That night, I barely slept, replaying the plan in my head over and over. Everything had to unfold exactly right. The timing, the paperwork, the witnesses, it all had to come together perfectly. Victoria had spent months wielding bureaucracy like a weapon against me, hiding behind official-looking documents and threats. But tomorrow, I was going to turn that same system against Hira, and I was going to do it right in front of the entire neighborhood. At 6 sharp the next morning, the steel gate installation truck pulled into my driveway. It was massive, the kind of truck that makes people stop and stare. The crew climbed out, professional and calm, armed with county permits, insurance papers, and everything they needed to build a fully legal security gate on private property. Just as I'd predicted, Victoria appeared on her usual morning walk right as the first steel panels were being unloaded. She stopped dead in her tracks, eyes narrowing as the realization dawned. Then, true to form, she whipped out her phone, her face twisting into that familiar mask of righteous indignation. She marched across the street, phone pressed to her ear, the other hand gesturing wildly at my property. "Officer Johnson, this is Victoria Cross from Lakeside Meadows. I need police response immediately. The Morrison property is putting up unauthorized structures on whole land, in direct violation of community standards and my repeated warnings." She was loud enough for half the block to hear, her voice ringing out like she was announcing the start of a war. I stepped outside onto my porch, clipboard in hand, projecting calm while the installation crew kept working as if nothing unusual was happening. Victoria paced back and forth, practically spitting words into her phone. "Yes, I have documented evidence of prior violations. Yes, I have the HOA property maps. This homeowner has ignored warnings and is now damaging community property." She ended the call and turned to me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "You have no idea what you've just started," she hissed. "But you're about to learn why we have rules in this community." About 15 minutes later, Officer Johnson pulled up, stepping out of his car looking tired but professional, clearly someone who'd rather be dealing with real crimes than HOA drama. He nodded politely to both of us. "All right," he said. "What's going on here?" Victoria pounced, practically reciting from memory. "Officer, this individual is building an unauthorized structure on HOA property. It's a direct violation of community regulations. I have documentation." She flourished her manila folder, her homemade maps, and papers she'd been brandishing around for weeks. I let her finish before quietly stepping forward and handing Officer Johnson my own folder. "Officer, here are the official county surveyor's report, historical property records dating back to 1963, and all the valid building permits issued by the county." As Officer Johnson flipped through my paperwork, I watched Victoria's self-assured mask start to crack. His eyes moved from her amateur maps to the county-sealed documents in my folder, then back again, checking permit numbers against his computer. The longer he looked, the more her confidence drained away. Finally, He closed the folder and turned to her. "Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice even. "According to these official county records, this is private property with documented lake access rights. Mr. Morrison is within his legal rights to install this gate." Victoria's face turned several shades in quick succession before settling into a paper white hue. By now, neighbors had started coming out to see what all the noise and flashing police lights were about. A small crowd formed on the sidewalk. Walter showed up, holding that old 1963 photograph, grinning like someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. The woman from House 12, the older couple with the kayaks, and a few others gathered to a people I'd spoken to during my door-to-door research. Victoria glanced at the growing crowd and seemed to realize this was spiraling out of her control and very publicly. "Since we're all here," I said, turning to face the neighbors, "I think there's something everyone needs to know about our HOA fees." I held up another folder, this one containing months of late-night research and accounting. "For the past 15 years, we've each been paying $50 a month for lake maintenance fees," I continued. "That's over $47,000 collected by the HOA supposedly to maintain and manage this lake." Faces around me shifted from curiosity to disbelief to anger. "Here's the problem," I went on, lifting the county survey and official property documents high enough for everyone to see. "According to these records, the HOA has never owned a single inch of this lake, not the water, not the shoreline, not even the access points." The silence that followed felt electric. Neighbors looked at one another, absorbing what that meant. That for 15 years, they'd been paying for maintenance on a lake the HOA had no legal right to touch. And standing there in the middle of it all, Victoria suddenly looked very small. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder as people began to process what I'd just revealed. "We've been paying $47,000 for lake maintenance to an HOA that never had any legal right to manage the lake in the first place." The eruption that followed was everything I'd hoped for and more. "What?" shouted a woman from House 12. $47,000? The elderly man with the kayak did the math out loud, his voice shaking with anger. "That's $9,000 my wife and I have paid over the years." Others jumped in. "Where did the money go? What maintenance? Show us the receipts." The crowd swelled and pressed closer. Victoria, caught in the middle, suddenly looked very small. Someone raised their phone and started filming. Seconds later, half the neighborhood had cameras pointed right at her. 15 years, yelled the man from House 18. 15 years of pain for nothing. A woman I didn't recognize stepped forward, voice trembling. "My husband and I are on a fixed income. We sacrificed to pay those fees." The elderly woman with the kayaks had tears in her eyes. "We could have gone to visit our grandchildren instead of paying for fake lake maintenance." Victoria tried to back away, but there was nowhere left to run. She stood frozen, surrounded by angry neighbors demanding answers she couldn't give, clutching documents she couldn't defend. "Please," she finally whispered, her voice small and breaking. "I was trying to protect the community, a broken bar to preserve what my father built. Nobody was buying it anymore." "You weren't protecting anything, Victoria, you were stealing from us," the woman from House 12 snapped. Victoria raised her voice again, trying to sound in control. "The fees were for administrative costs and environmental protection." "For what?" someone shot back. "Where's the equipment? Where are the reports? Show us." Questions rained down from every side. $47,000. "Victoria, where is it?" Each answer she offered only sounded weaker than the last, and the anger around her only grew. Then Walter stepped forward, holding that old photograph. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had taught hundreds of students over decades. "Folks," he began, "I've lived here longer than India and I've kept silent for too long." He raised the photo so everyone could see. "This is Victoria's father, signing the papers that sold this land." And right behind him, that sign, "A public lake access, permanent by county order." Victoria has known the truth for years. Victoria's last attempt to hold on to her power was painful to watch. "My father built this community," she shouted, her voice cracking. "My family sacrificed everything for this place." Tears spilled down her face, but the crowd stood unmoved. "Preserve what?" someone called out bitterly. "You banned us from the lake and charged us for the privilege." I turned, walked to my newly installed gate, and mounted the bronze plaque I had made. Public lake access, a grandfathered easement. 1963. HOA has no authority. Then, with every eye on me, I pulled out the remote control and pressed the button. The steel gate slid shut with a deep, final click that echoed like justice. Victoria stood there, staring completely defeated as the very symbol of her power literally closed in her face. The aftermath came quickly. Neighbors began talking about legal action to recover the money. Someone mentioned calling the state attorney general's office. Others demanded new leadership for the HOA. Victoria turned away, her shoulders slumped, her manila folder hanging uselessly at her side. She walked home like someone who had just lost everything. An hour later, a little girl slipped free from her mother's hand and ran to the water, splashing in for the first time in years. "Mom!" she shouted. "We can finally go swimming." Her laughter broke the tension. Soon, other families wandered down to the lake, remembering what it felt like to actually enjoy what they'd been paying for all along. I handed the remote to Walter. "For the neighbor who told the truth when it mattered," I said. His eyes glistened as he accepted it. By that afternoon, the video of Victoria's meltdown and the gate closing had gone viral on local social media. The hashtag #HoKarma started trending. Other neighborhoods shared their own HOA horror stories. Messages poured in from people facing the same kind of petty tyranny across the state. Sometimes David really does beat Goliath, and sometimes it isn't just about winning, it's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The lake belongs to everyone now, just like it always should have. Video ends with a call to action. What would you have done in Jake's situation? Type a justice served in the comments. And if you loved seeing Victoria finally get what she deserved, hit that subscribe button for more HOA revenge stories. And what did we learn today? Probably nothing, but it was fun, wasn't it?